Ladies and gentlemen, I am particularly pleased to welcome you all to this workshop today, organized by the Secretariat of the Convention of Biological Diversity on the theme of the financial sector and the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. I will be your master of ceremony today. The workshop was designed to facilitate a dialogue among the different players from the financial community, representative of the CBD parties and other stakeholders, on how the finance sector can most effectively contribute to the post-2020 global biodiversity framework and to identify key actions needed for its implementation. The workshop is expected to help participants to build mutual understanding between the global public and private financial sector and the CBD community as a basis for a stronger collaboration. And this will be the aim of our seminar today. And it's also supposed to identify key actions that could put the global financial sector with governments and regulators on track to contribute to the objectives of an ambitious post-2020 framework and to identify commitments of parties within the framework that would be needed to facilitate this contribution most effectively. And this will be the objectives of our work tomorrow. Expert groups have been working over the last few months on the organization of this event and have started to establish a dialogue between all actors. I sincerely thank them for their work, as well as my CBD colleagues who have worked hard over the past week to organize this event. Before we begin, let me give you some housekeeping information. This meeting will be sound recorded for the purpose of future referencing by the Secretariat only. It is broadcasted on YouTube on the CBD channel. All microphones and cameras have been cut, and you will be given the floor by the technical team, as it was just explained before, when the chair will ask you to raise your hand. At this moment, please press the raised hand button at the bottom of your screen, which will turn yellow. Your request will be entered in the queue list visible to the chair. When the chair will give you the floor, the technical team will open your microphone and your speak button will turn blue. Please press the speak button, and when it turns red, you have all the colors, you may start to speak. And finally, the chat is available only for IT issues. We won't manage this chat today. So I've now the pleasure to invite the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, Mrs. Elizabeth Maruma Mrema, to introduce the workshop. Mrs. Maruma Mrema, you have the floor.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really honored and happy to welcome you all to this workshop organized by us, the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity, in collaboration with the financial sector. This workshop is one of the key steps for the success of our next conference of the parties 15. I'm sure it will also allow us all to facilitate a structured dialogue and to build mutual understanding between the global financial sector, both private and public, and the CBD community as a basis for stronger collaboration on the role of finance in the development and implementation of the future post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Indeed, the CBD community and the financial sector know too little about each other, even though success in tackling the biodiversity crisis depends on them effectively working together. Financial sector participation was critical to the success of the COP12 of climate change. The alignment of financial flows with global mitigation and adaptation goals was included as one of the 3 goals set out by the Paris Agreement. Achieving the support from the financial sector in the lead up to the agreement was key, as was the agreement's clear mandate for the financial sector to play a role. It is going to be equally important for the successful conference of the parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity to be held in Kunming, China, and for the effective implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. I'm pleased that today and tomorrow you will be discussing how to put nature at the service of the greater financial sector resilience. We certainly need the engagement of the public and private financial sector, but also we need the central banks, the regulators, and the governments to all work together. The role of experts from the civil society and the academia will equally be important in this process. The financial community has a critical leverage role to pivot economic sectors towards more positive impacts on nature beyond climate change. The call for it to act will become even louder as the world strengthens its nature goals and build new techniques to measure nature loss. I strongly believe that the global financial sector, public and private, can be strategic allies of governments and regulators for implementing biodiversity policies. You have a key role to play in assessing nature-related financial risks of transitioning economic sectors to more sustainable pathways, in mitigating these risks through relevant standards and disclosing these risks and opportunities. For example, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, for which I'm also honored to co-chair, is one of those platforms going to develop tools and standards for measuring not just risks or safeguards, but also opportunities for encouraging biodiversity positive investments. The proposals you will work on during these 2 days are essential and will help us in the development of the future global biodiversity framework and its implementation. I'm also delighted that our two co-chairs on the development of the global biodiversity framework are with us in this workshop to share with you and to listen to you on your role and what then needs to be built into that framework moving forward. I look forward to your discussions today and your hard work, including tomorrow. I will get back to you at the end of the workshop to really hear with eagerness your proposals and propose those next steps. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best and good work.
Thank you, Mrs. Mwema, for your warm welcome. You have set us ambitious objectives for this workshop. So I'm now pleased to invite two representatives from the financial sector and governments or parties to introduce the workshop. First of all, Mr. Saker Nusebe, CEO of International Business of Federated Hermes. Mr. Nusebe couldn't be with us today, but he sent us a video. So, Mr. Nusebe, you have the floor, and can you please play the video? Thank you.
Good morning and welcome to the CBD workshop sessions over the next 2 days on the GBF for Diversity Post-2020. I'm Saker Nusebe, I'm the CEO of Federated Hermes International. Some of you might know that for many, many years, we've been at the leading front of trying to integrate the risks that we see around the world into all financial decisions. I remember attending a meeting as part of the Carbon Tracker initiative. Remember, they're the ones who came up with stranded assets as an idea in the Bank of England some years ago, when people thought that the idea of carbon's intersection with finance was far-fetched and that only the scientists cared about global warming. And look at where we are now and how far we've come. I think the world now is coming around to understanding that biodiversity is just as important, if not more so. Arguably, what the world has gone through over the last 18 months with COVID and the way that new viruses are spreading is linked to a reduction in the biodiversity, the dangers that we see to future food supplies, to the dangers we see geopolitically to future migration patterns are as much related to the dangers to reducing biodiversity as they are to global warming, and they are, of course, interrelated. We at Federated Hermes International think these are very important questions. They sit at the heart of how we as a society deploy our capital, because our capital shapes the society that we live in future. Over the next 2 days, we're going to have lots of workshops. And I think I'm hoping that we come up with an ambitious global framework, GBF, that then takes us forward into the next stage of ensuring that thoughts about and caring about and ensuring that we protect our biodiversity sits at the heart of our agenda, so that we ensure that our species, that our children, that future generations continue to enjoy the world that we inherited and we pass it on. This is the whole concept of stewardship. We live on this planet as stewards, and we hand it to the next generation of our species as stewards. Thank you very much. Enjoy the seminars, and I do hope we come out with an ambitious program. Goodbye.
Thank you, Mr. Nusebe. And now, Mr. Franz Perez, Swiss Ambassador for the Environment. Mr. Perez, you have the floor. Mr. Perez, can you please open the mic of Mr. Perez? Thank
you. Does it work now?
Please go, please go.
Perfect. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, everybody. It is an honor to welcome you at this important workshop and a pleasure to see such a large number of participants from around the world, from the financial and the corporate sector, government, international organization, and the civil society. As you all know, we are in the middle of negotiating the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework to improve the state of the biodiversity to improve the state of biodiversity and reverse the concerning trends in biodiversity loss. The urgency and magnitude cannot be underestimated. As head of the Swiss delegation to the negotiation of the Paris Agreement, it was absolutely clear to me that finance was a critical element in order to be able to get agreement on the Paris Agreement. As just said by Elizabeth Mrema, we would not have been able to agree on Paris on the agreement without a robust and effective and good goal on finance. In order to be able to adopt the framework on biodiversity, we will also need a credible answer how its implementation can be financed. And as in the Paris Agreement, the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework will need a goal on finance. To achieve the objectives of the Global Biodiversity Framework, it will be necessary first to reduce, redirect, and eliminate resources causing harm to biodiversity. Second, to mobilize resources from all sources, including public and private sources, including from government and public and private financial institutions at the domestic and international level. And thirdly, to increase the efficiency and effectiveness and transparency of the use of these resources. In short, the flow of financial resources will have to be aligned with objectives of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, with a net positive biodiversity outcome. Financial institutions will have to play a central role in mobilizing of the necessary financial resources and alignment of financial flows with net positive biodiversity outcomes more generally. Because of this, we are very happy that initiatives such as the Task Force on Nature-related Disclosures have been launched and received a lot of positive attention from the industry and from governments around the world. We are looking forward to a new framework for financial institutions to report and act on nature-related risks to facilitate a shift in global financial flows from nature negative towards nature positive outcomes. As a global financial hub, Switzerland is fully cognizant of the importance of the financial sector and its role in resource mobilization. The Swiss government is committed to work with the various actors of its financial sector to become a global hub for sustainable finance. In line with this, we have supported the further development of the Encore tool. The tool was developed to help financial institutions to better assess and integrate natural capital risks in their activities and align their portfolios with biodiversity targets. Moving forward, it is key that we not only assess the risks of financial assets associated with the loss of biodiversity, but also, and more importantly, the impacts of financial assets and flows on biodiversity worldwide. Global financial flows need to be assessed, and they are essential to facilitate the systemic change which needs to be achieved to reverse the trend and improve the global state of the biodiversity. Therefore, Switzerland is advocating for the inclusion of the new goal speaking to the alignment of financial flows in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. We are keen to learn from all of you present today how such a goal could facilitate additional actions and commitments by the financial sector for biodiversity. Which elements need to be incorporated in the post-2020 global biodiversity framework to provide the necessary framework conditions for all actors, in particular the financial sector, to contribute to a net positive biodiversity development. I wish you a successful workshop and look forward to an engaged and fruitful exchange over the next 2 days. I hope it will lead to concrete and tangible outcomes that will facilitate the further evolvement of the post-2020 framework and identification of possible actions by all of us to contribute to a net biodiversity development, and most importantly, that will help us to achieve the objective of the post-2025 global biodiversity framework together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Perez, for your stimulating message and warm welcome. So during these 2 days, we will be speaking a lot about the post-2020 global biodiversity framework to be adopted in Kunming, China, in order for everyone to know what the current version of this framework contains, the planned development and the current and future links with the financial sector. Mr. Basil Van Havre and Mr. Francis Ogwals, who are co-chairs of the open-ended working group for the CBD, will present it to us. So Mr. Van Havre and Mr. Ogwal, you have the floor for 10 minutes. I don't know who is the first. Can you both connect, please?
Good day to all. I will start, and then Francis is connected, and we'll pick up in the second half of the presentation. It's a pleasure to be addressing you, and we will go through a few slides explaining. And let's start with the next one. I thought it would be good to situate how the Convention on Biological Diversity work and where does this come from. So it's one of the 3 Rio Convention. You probably know more about the climate, the UNFCCC, and then you probably know perhaps a little bit later about the Convention on Combating Desertification. So those 3 conventions works together. How we work, this is a framework convention, so it works by setting objective for 10-year period and reviewing them as we go. And what we're doing now with this negotiation of what we call a global biodiversity framework is the set of objectives for the period to 2030. The last one were the HE targets. I will be referring to that a little bit, and you may have heard about HE target 11, which was around 17% protection of 17% of land and 10% of sea. What is important to keep in mind is that there is an increasing recognition that we need to be successful not only on climate, not only on nature, not on development and people, but our prosperity and success over the future is based on being successful on the 3 at the same time. So it's not one or the other, it is all the 3 together. Next slide, please. So now let's look at the rationale on the top of the slide. This is the reason why we're doing this, the assessment that was done by a group called the panel on biodiversity, international panel on biodiversity and environmental service. It's similar to the IPCC, but on the biodiversity side. And we're facing a very big risk. You heard about the risk of extinction. And this is our last chance to put the system back on track. Why should you care? Why do finance care? Why do business care? 1/3 of our economy is depending on nature, and that range from transport, it range to agriculture, of course, fiber, construction, so a lot. Last change to put the system back on track, well, the HE targets, our predecessor, worked very hard, but the fact is none of the 2020 targets were fully met. There was progress in many cases, but none were fully met. There was also deficiencies in reporting and review. So the parties, with the COP, was the organism making decision, decided to go forward with a new GBF, and they gave us, Francis and I, a number of principles. I won't read through all of them, but what I want to point you is the notion of being science-based, being comprehensive, visible, transparent, efficient, and flexible. So basically, that translates into giving us realistic yet ambitious targets. We're not in the realm of aspirational targets at all. Those can, have to be able to be implemented, and robust reporting and review process. At the bottom, some characteristics that are important is we realize, and I see collectively realize, that the previous framework was really the framework of Ministry of the Environment in each of the parties, and pretty much nobody else. And that was a problem. So we want to create a framework for all parts of society, including you, financial institution, multilateral development bank, private finance. And that's why it's so important for us to be listening to what you're going to tell us over the next 2 days. We want to adopt a language that is generic and can be understood by all. You will learn in a few minutes that Francis and I and our team are in the process of drafting a new full draft, and the peril of falling into jargon is there, and we're trying to get away from that. And then we want to build a system for commitment and performance that is open to all. So that means that the commitments that business, that other sectors can do will be also important. Next slide, please. So here it is. This is a grammatic or a graphical depiction of what we're trying to accomplish, and it should be read from right to left. On purple on the right is the vision, living in harmony with nature. That vision is not for negotiation. What is for negotiation is everything to the left. And basically, what we realized is that there was a need to translate that very lofty vision that is everybody can agree to in terms that are measurable. And that's how we came with the notion of 2050 goals and perhaps some milestone around it. The convention has 3 objectives. You're probably aware of the first one, which is around conservation, which is probably a little bit lesser known, is the second one, which is around how nature contributes to people. And that's the second goal in orange. Below that is the third goal of the convention, which is around sharing the benefit arising from the utilization of biodiversity. And at the bottom, parties have asked us to have a fourth goal on ensuring there is means of implementation. Now let's move to the center of this graph. That's where the action is, and that's where the targets that we call the action targets here, and we have grouped them into several categories that are loosely related to the goal, but not exactly. The first 7 are addressing what we call the direct driver of biodiversity loss, as identified by the panel of experts, scientific experts. And you will recognize things that you've seen in many places. Target 1, the need is around the need to do land use planning that recognize biodiversity, retaining wild lands, restoring degraded lands. And target 2 is the successor to the famous 17% targets. Many people arguing it should be 30%. So the 30 by 30 moniker has been widely used. Species recovery, number of action, making sure that harvest, trade, and use of species is legal and sustainable. Invasive alien species, you heard about that. Pesticide, Nutrients and plastic under the general term of pollution will be very important. And then, of course, climate change. And we've talked about the linkage to the climate change. Below that, there is a group of targets around how we meet people's needs, and a lot of economic activities fall under that: fisheries, agriculture, forestry, but there is a lot more. Health and culture. And then at the bottom, there is these targets around the benefit sharing, which is related to the goal. On the left side, you see tools and solution. And Francis, in a minute, will go into more detail about a number of those targets that are relevant to you, particularly 13, 14, 17, and 18. So I won't dwell too much on those. The only point I will make on those is this target in the middle, 15, on sustainable consumption and responsible choice. We're talking here about the indirect drivers of growth, choice we all make when we purchase foods at a grocery store, or we choose to take certain activity or not. All that is done into a frame of a transparency and responsibility system, enabling condition and means of implementation. So if we can move to the next slide. Now, what does that mean for you, and what are we trying to do, and what change will that do? Well, if we're going to meet that vision of living in harmony with nature, keeping in mind all the change we're seeing around the globe, particularly for climate, we're going to see some major change to many systems. And first and foremost, the agri-food system, both in terms of demands and how production is done, there will be some very, very big change. Extractive industries, infrastructure from gray to green. What we're being told by experts is this is a future that is not only viable and sustainable, but is in fact better, one that citizens should be aspiring to. This is one that's going to be increasingly reliable, where I think our industries will be prosperous, and where we're going to be developing socially very well. The challenge is the transition, and how we're going to be sustaining that change process, both from a people will. So will our citizens be willing to engage into that significant change? Will they see the value of the new system that we're proposing? And will the resource be there? Where those resources come from? And that's where you're coming into play. And I've seen the progress and the change that has been done on the finance, on the climate side, and hope that we're going to be able to replicate that. Next slide, please. That's the last slide I will present, and I'll turn it over to Francis. This is a one-page representation of the resource mobilization or finance equation. So if you look at the left side of the slide there, the representation of where we are today, that's the black box at the bottom. Roughly, the estimation is that there is between 125 and 145 billion being spent on biodiversity. And that represents a little bit less than what would be needed in terms of direct conservation. The big part that is still unmet is that compensation and transition that would be needed to make the significant change in a number of sectors. The good news is, aside from that, I don't know if I can call that a good news or a bad news, but there is a significant amount of resources that is currently going into subsidies that are not helping us. The solution is a combination of three factors. Is first, the reduction and eventually elimination and repurposing of negative subsidies. So that is bringing down the need, as you can see on the 2030 picture, but also increasing available resources. And that's going to be done in terms of a number of different opportunities, capitalizing on the money coming from climate in terms of nature-based solution, increasing obviously what we call overseas direct assistance, but that's probably is not going to be a big part of the equation. Offset, private finance, charities, etc. So we feel that there is a solution. What we're looking forward is in the discussion, and I know many of you have been working hard over the past months and years on that, is as we can see the solution. So that completes my part, and I pass the floor over to Francis. Francis, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I hope you can hear me out there. Thank you so much,
That's okay.
Basil. First, I have to say that when you're talking about financing the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, then in many ways we are saying that if that framework is resourced, however good it is only going to remain on paper. And that's why we are talking of this aspect of financing early, because the challenges we had with the current strategic plan, or the one that just ended last year, is that it was not properly financed, and therefore implementation became a challenge. And I heard the Swiss ambassador, speaking to a goal that could deal with the finance, and that was one of the key outcomes, of, perhaps, of the Paris Agreement. Those are lessons learned, and I think we are going to be thinking really carefully about resourcing this framework. So if we go to the next slide, please. So some of these, my co-chair has just mentioned them, so perhaps just to let you know how the framework itself is talking to resourcing, the different ways we are trying to look at it. And we are looking at mainstreaming as one of those avenues. He has already talked about eliminating those harmful subsidies. But on mainstreaming, there is currently our updated zero draft. There's target 13, which basically deals with integrating biodiversity values into policies, regulations, planning, development processes, poverty reduction strategies, and accounts at all levels, ensuring that biodiversity values are mainstreamed across all sectors and integrated into assessments of environmental impact. So perhaps as the financial sector, this could be one thing you need to look at. Development going to come, people are going to be coming requesting for support from the financial sector, but how are they embedding in, how are they mainstream biodiversity? And that is why the aspect of environmental impact assessment then has to be looked at critically. Are they taking on biodiversity? Now, when it comes to the part that is dealing with eliminating those or redirecting some full subsidies, we also have a target 17 that basically we are looking at how are we going to be advising on redirecting, repurposing, reforming, or eliminating those incentives that are harmful for biodiversity. And I think, again, here, the private sector or the financial institutions, you have a very big role to play here. Not all the projects could be good for biodiversity. At the end of the day, it could be only beneficial to the entity that is pursuing that business. But what about the angle of conservation, of enhancing biodiversity values? Is it there or not? So these are the things we need to be looking at as we move forward with resource mobilization. We are going to become or be very innovative when we're approaching the financial aspects. And therefore, we have to look at, as I'm saying, are those investments really having positive outcomes? If not, then we need to be looking at it critically and see that it is not at the disadvantage of nature, ensuring the no net loss concept, as we are now talking about. And therefore, this task force that is looking at nature or disclosing the impact of development on nature is going to be very important to us. That task force, I think, is going to help us a lot when we are looking at some of these issues. And then when we are talking about also the financial aspects, the perhaps most important aspect to look at here is the developing countries. How are their financing needs going to be addressed? Because this is where the challenge lies most. They have actions, they have NBSAFs, they have everything they want to do, but they are financially not able to. And also we know perhaps that is still where most of the biodiversity is. So how are we going to look at that issue? Now, when it comes to the part that deals with the resource mobilization, there is a specific target 18 that is basically saying we are going to be looking at increasing financial resources from all international and domestic resources through additional and effective financial resources commensurate with the ambition of the goals and targets of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And this is the crux of the matter. People are telling us to be ambitious with this framework. When they see certain targets, they say you're not ambitious. Now, the challenge is going to be this: are we going to be ambitious equally with the financial aspects? If not, then those two will not be talking together, and so one will be left behind. That is implementation. So we have to match those two very well. Ambition on both the targets or the goals, but also on the resources to implement them. Let's
Mr.
go to the
Ogwal,
next.
sorry. Can I ask you to conclude in 2 minutes, please?
Yep, I can.
Thank you.
I think this was the most critical, please. Next slide. So those are the potential sources where we could get the finances. You have the international financial flows, domestic, innovative solution. I was talking about how the private sector needs to come in place, but also the donors out there. We still need to be looking at opportunities that could come, bilateral opportunities, benefit sharing. My co-chair talked about it. We can explain it more. I already talked about this task force on risks. So these are the opportunities that will come for us to really know. I think one thing we should know that where biodiversity loss is occurring, it is a big risk to financial sector. Let's go. Next slide. It's not flowing. Okay. So of course, when you have the financial resources also, we have to how we are going to be efficient, how we are going to be effective and transparent in use of those resources. But let's be honest that you see a lot of emphasis right now being put on climate change and the COVID recovery. We can see how best we could leverage those, but also our national planning processes where they're occurring, revision of NDPs, national development plans, we could take advantage of that capacity build, then the focus on ownership results from the different stakeholders. And then also we need to look at the part that deals with the commitment. Really, you have to have people committed and they report on their commitment. And we would go to the next slide and then I finish, if it is there. So in conclusion, the design of the global biodiversity framework is definitely going to be challenging for us, but also we see it as opportunity that could give us targets that could, help us to do the implementation. And we want to see that we engage all the key actors, including, of course, the financial sector, but importantly, that the financial package that will unlock its implementation. So we need to be looking at how best this time around we actually have opportunities that can help us unlock financial resources. They are there, but I think it is how we harness them that is going to be something we need to be discussing and agreeing on them. And of course, this implementation should bring us the change that we want, the 2050 vision. I think this would do it if I'm not mistaken.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Van Ogwal. I think everyone now is well informed about the current version of this future global biodiversity framework. And without waiting, I've now the pleasure to invite Mr. Majun to give us an overview of the links between biodiversity loss and financial stability. Mr. Majung, you are chairman of the Green Finance Committee of China Society for Finance and Banking, advisor to the People's Bank of China, co-chair of the G20 Working Group on Green Finance, and recently co-chair of the research workstream on biodiversity and financial stability of the Network of Central Banks and Supervisors for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS. So, Mr. Majung, you have the floor for 10 minutes. Thank you. Can you please give the floor to Mr. Majun? You have to raise your hand first, and after the floor will be given to you. Mr. Majun, if you hear me, you have to raise your hand with the button at the bottom of your screen, and the moderator will give you the floor.
Unfortunately, we don't see the hand raised yet. So if possible, please raise the hand and then we'll open the microphone. Thank you.
Mr. Majun or Mr. Tianmen, do you hear me? Can you raise your hand?
Yes,
Thank you.
can you hear me?
Yes, that's fine. Please go.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank the Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity for inviting me to join this workshop on the finance sector and the global biodiversity framework. It's my great honor and pleasure to be part of this important discussion. Financial policy makers and institutions are gearing up to the COP26 climate summit, which will focus on how to move forward the climate agenda and how to expand investment for net zero. Since the beginning of this year, I've been invited to probably 100 meetings on how to finance carbon neutrality. This is how much enthusiasm people have now on the climate topic. Across the international community, the topic of protecting nature is also gaining attention ahead of the UN Biodiversity Conference, which will be held in Kunming, China, partly because of the realization that ecosystem degradation is a key driver of zoonotic diseases such as COVID-19. However, relative to climate, the biodiversity agenda remains quite underdeveloped in the financial sector. A recent survey of the world's largest fund managers found that 86% of them made no reference to ecosystem protection, natural capital, or biodiversity in their policies. This needs to change. It's clear that human beings and our economic activities rely heavily on nature, as it provides us with food and a range of critical ecosystem services. Professor Das Gupta, in his recent publication, said that the stock of natural capital per person has declined by nearly 40% since 1992, the year of the Convention of Biodiversity was signed. Many ecosystems have been degraded beyond repair or are getting close to tipping points, which could have catastrophic consequences for our economy and well-being. Also, a study by the Central Bank of Netherlands showed that 36% of investments by its financial institutions are heavily dependent on ecosystem services. Several factors have contributed to the lack of attention to valuing biodiversity in economic and financial decision-making. These include, number one, the lack of mechanisms to measure and price the negative externality of human activities, especially investment activities, on nature in general and biodiversity in particular. Number two is a lack of understanding of how the loss of biodiversity may impact economic sustainability and the safety of financial assets. To ensure that the financial system plays a more constructive role in protecting nature, rather than financing activities that lead to degradation, we need to improve the understanding of the relationship between nature and finance, and based on that, to change the behavior of the financial institutions in dealing with nature. There are several positive signs that this is happening. One is that 55 financial institutions managing $9 trillion in assets have committed to take ambitious action to protect biodiversity. Another encouraging development is the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, which has been established formally recently. And a couple of months ago, the NGFS, namely the Central Banks and Supervisors Network for Greening the Financial System, together with INSPIRE, a research network working with the NGFS, jointly launched a study group to look into the relationship between biodiversity and financial stability. I have the honor to co-chair the study group on behalf of NGFS, together with Professor Nick Robin, who is the head of INSPIRE. This study group aims to establish an evidence-based approach to how central banks and supervisors could fulfill their mandates in the context of biodiversity loss, with an initial focus on land use and deforestation. Specifically, the study group will look into 4 issues. First, a comprehensive review of the relationship between biodiversity and the economy, especially the impact of loss of biodiversity on economic activities. Second, the relationship between finance and biodiversity, namely how investment affects biodiversity and how loss of biodiversity leads to financial risks. Number 3, we'll do a stock take on emerging practices among central banks, regulators, and financial institutions in protecting nature and revealing nature-related financial risks. And number 4, we are developing options or recommendations on how central banks and regulators should act on nature. Some emerging options include enhancing regulatory requirements for financial institutions to measure and report the impact of the investment activities on biodiversity, and advising these institutions to stress test the impact of biodiversity loss on financial risk indicators, such as asset quality and valuation. We hope that further investigation in this direction can help lay the foundations for financial regulators to take meaningful steps towards protecting biodiversity and ecosystem. And the global coordination mechanisms, such as G20, NGFS, IPSF, IOSCO, IFIS, will devote more attention to nature-related issues. In this context, today's workshop is very much welcome, fostering dialogue around the global biodiversity framework and its implementation between governments, regulators, central banks, and financial sector participants is fundamental. Once again, let me thank the organizers for inviting me to this event, and I wish the workshop a great success.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Majun, for your inspiring speech, which clearly set the scene for this workshop. So following your speech, the next 2 panels will give us an overview of the role and actions of public and private financial institutions on the one hand, and governments and regulators on the other, in jointly addressing the global biodiversity crisis. So let's go now to the first panel. I'm very pleased to introduce Mr. Simon Zadek, who will chair this first panel on why is nature important to financial institutions and investors, and what can they do to address the global biodiversity crisis. Mr. Zadek is chair of the Finance for Biodiversity Initiative and director of Migrant Nation. He is co-chair of the technical expert group of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, and has held many other roles in the UN, governments, and academia. So Simon, you have the floor until normally 3:15 p.m. in Europe, so you can have 5 minutes more, but we are really late. Thank you, Simon, you have the floor. If you raise your hand, the moderator will give you the floor. Yes. Can you please give the floor to Mr. Zadek?
Good. I think I'm there. Odile, thank you very much. And actually, I wanted to just thank you personally for making this happen, but also really for your role with others in driving forward the private finance agenda in the context of CBD. I think it's a hugely important track of work, and as many of the open speakers have highlighted, should and could make a lot of difference to outcomes going forward. I have a fantastic panel, and I'm going to start just by introducing them, and I am instructed by my minders to ask each of the panelists when I introduce them just to press that raise hand button so that you can be technically brought into the conversation. So we will have, as this panel, Mr. Peter van der Werf from Robeco. We will have Ms. Madeleine Ronquest from First Rand, Mr. Sylvain Vanston from the AXA Group, Ms. Mario Donetto from the Inter-American Development Bank, and Ms. Sherry Madeira from LSEG and Refinitiv. Now, just before I turn to the panel, perhaps just a couple of opening comments, not to repeat, I think, the very good statements that have already been made, but perhaps to reinforce 2 or 3 things that I want this panel and hopefully over the next 2 days for us to collectively address. Firstly, it's clearly tough to integrate nature into financial decision-making. And I don't think anyone who is a practitioner is under any illusions that this problem is going to be solved momentarily. But secondly, those same practitioners, I think, and we've really seen this already in the context of the development of the TNFD, there are many practitioners who are solving it as they go. Yeah, and I don't want to call out particular financial institutions, but there are many financial institutions that are already in the business of measuring many aspects of nature, both a narrow view of materiality to themselves, as well as a broader view of nature dependency and nature impact. And thirdly, and I think the points have been made by Basile and others earlier in the discussion, we need to move faster, and we need to climb on the shoulders of our experience of the climate agenda in seeing how those pathways that in many ways the climate agenda has opened up to us can allow those working on nature to accelerate much more quickly. Just to illustrate Marjoon's comments about the NGFS, we don't have to recreate the NGFS, it's there. And many aspects of what we've learned from TCFD, we are already leveraging into the design of TNFD moving forward. I wanted just then to sort of conclude perhaps with a couple of comments, and then we'll move on to the panel. First, this is the context of CBD, and we need to really understand how CBD can support the mainstreaming of nature into financial decision-making, private and public, it has to be stressed. And that has a lot to do with target setting. For those of us in the financial community, we know that we need a clear policy framework in order to build an effective transition risk pathway and understanding of risk. And so that work needs to be done by all of us in the market, around the market, and CBD needs to be part of that process. Secondly, we need to really understand what's going on already, because we don't have to invent things that are already in motion. Rather, we need to find ways to amplify them. And that really brings me onto the third and what will be the final segment of the panel, which is what are the buttons we need to press in the middle of a profusion of different activities. We're at that point in the innovation curve where everybody is talking about nature and finance that really can give us those catalyzing, amplifying, and accelerating effects. So with that, I'm going to turn to the panel, who I think are really well placed to address these and other questions. We're going to do 3 rounds. The first round really focused on short views from each of the panelists as to what's already going on, really drawing from their own personal experiences and institutional experiences. The second round really focusing on what are the buttons we need to press to really move much faster. And then in the third round, we'll turn to the questions hopefully coming from the floor and see if panelists can address some of those time permitting. So I'm going to start with you, Peter, if I may, and I'll follow the list on the program really with the first question, which is kind of what's already going on and looking particularly at your world rather than the broader domain out there.
Thank you, Simon, for the question. With Robeco as a global asset manager, we have been conducting a lot of work on climate, but also see the need to accelerate our work on biodiversity. So to that end, we've signed the Finance for Biodiversity pledge. So I think that's a very clear set of expectations for investors and for banks in terms of how to relate to the global biodiversity framework and ultimately setting targets by 2024, and to really make our organization ready for that. And in delivering that to our clients, we've set up a biodiversity task force that basically has a roadmap with a lot of the ingredients that are really necessary. So we're working on developing a biodiversity footprinting methodology together with the Partnership for Biodiversity Accounting Financials. We've also contributed to the informal working group for setting up the TNFD. And at the same time, we see, I think, in terms of collaborative engagement, and I think that's also a part where I'm responsible for within our organization, a very clear need for this to expand beyond the work that we're currently doing on soft commodities. That's something we've started last year. It's very targeted, focuses on deforestation, but there is a larger need for a global program. So that's where Robeco, with other interested parties, is now really exploring if a Nature Action 100 could be developed. And I think this is also where ultimately we can really define those global asks for the largest corporations having exposure either on impacts or on dependencies on biodiversity, and how we can get those corporations to work with biodiversity, to develop board accountability, to start with their disclosures, and really think about how a biodiversity policy in their respective footprint would look like. And I think those are crucial elements that ultimately will help Robeco to also manage our investment portfolios in also delivering against the global biodiversity framework. And for that, I think it's really important to have also support of the governments in obviously embracing and developing a firm framework, which also can be clear in terms of targets for the financial institution to connect with. So I think that's really where we stand today with our work.
Fantastic, Peter. And we will come back because we want to get that sort of 60-second shot on that Nature Action 100 that you seductively kind of put in front of us. So we'll come back to that in the second round. Madeline, I'm going to go straight on to you, part of the financial community, totally different part of the planet and approach. Kind of where does nature fit in today to what you and First Round are doing?
Thank you, Simon. Yes, I think we've been monitoring impacts on biodiversity for a very long time. However, there are two challenges with that. It was very much based on per activity. So we will look at a singular transaction and we will assess that transaction in regards to its impact. However, looking at a singular transaction does not give you a systemic risk view. And so I think that has been lacking to a large extent. We have many policies on biodiversity, natural capital as well. And we cover it from various angles. So from a risk perspective and from an ethical finance perspective, because sometimes there aren't any perimeters in our legislation, although we have very good legislation. And then we make an ethical or a moral decision as the board on what we will engage with and what not. So these challenges are being addressed at the moment, and what we are doing is we are using the great momentum and scale that climate change has brought to us, and we are riding on that experience that we're going through now, because that is really elevating climate risk on scale. And so because there's an overlap, we are definitely looking at how we can integrate it, almost without the business realizing that there's another set of framework that they need to comply with. I think everybody understands the impacts on biodiversity. And we are also involved in global practices and developments, TNFD, the PBAF, as Peter had mentioned, and so on, to make sure that we are aligned with what is happening globally, and that we are also addressing very specific issues to the sub-Saharan African parts of the continent.
And actually, I'm really pleased you said that at the end, because I'd hate to think we're just aligning to what's happening internationally. I hope you're ensuring that what's happening internationally is aligning to your and the region, the needs of the region that you're in. And I'm sure that that's exactly what you'll be doing in the TNFD and elsewhere going forward. Thank you, Madeline. I'm going to jump through to Sylvain, who I can't actually physically see, but I'm hoping that with the help of the moderators, there is the man. So coming back to Europe, with a lens onto the insurance sector, Sylvain, you've been very involved as well in TNFD, of course, but would be really keen to understand particularly what's happening on the underwriting side of the AXA group.
Sure, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yeah, a little louder would be good.
A little louder? Okay, hold on. Is this better?
Yeah.
Right. Indeed, so I work in the AXA group, and so we're both a large asset owner and of course a large insurer, both commercial lines and retail. We've been very active, you're right, Simon. We've been very active, but only since 2018. Frankly, 2018 was the 2014 moment for climate. This was just before COP21. We knew there was a problem. We didn't quite know how to capture it, to measure it, what to do about it, but we had started to worry. And then we acted quite on quite a few topics. Now, at first, what we do, we've developed a few guidelines. For example, as early as 2013, we put out a palm oil policy, so we don't invest in or underwrite companies that are producing unsustainable palm oil. This is quite basic, but it's actually, exclusions guidelines are always very tricky to implement, actually. Right now, we're expanding this policy into a more fully fledged deforestation policy, which will address other drivers, of course, of deforestation and land use conversion. So that's a very important part. A lot of what we do on climate change is also, of course, quite helpful for protecting nature. And here also we've been very active on the underwriting front, also with restrictions. We're trying also to encourage so-called nature positive outcomes. We do this mostly through our impact investment funds. We have an impact fund that's wholly dedicated to nature solutions. We launched it in the G7 meetings in 2019 together with a report that was quite helpful called Into the Wild. So this was actually our first report about nature loss. But we still don't do this systematically on the underwriting front. I still don't know how to identify and support clients that are producing nature positive outcomes. So that is work that is ahead of us, how to accompany clients, typically on the commercial lines front, to better protect nature. That's work that's ahead of us.
Brilliant, Sylvain, and thank you for that. And I think it's absolutely right, AXA as a leading insurance company in the sustainability space, to be both describing what you're doing, but also highlighting what still has to be done, which we'll come back to in a second. And I also think, picking up on what both you and Madeleine have highlighted, leveraging the work you're doing on climate, both technically but also institutionally in terms of leadership, is clearly an important piece of the story. And I'll just put the health warning on the table that doing climate doesn't do nature. And I know both of you entirely agree with that, but I think it's really important to point out critical overlaps, scientific, biophysical dynamics between the two, but actually there's a whole bunch of stuff that needs to be done on the nature space that is not covered by the term, it's fine, I'm doing climate. I know you're entirely aligned to that. Maria, perhaps I can come to you. Again, a shift in location, moving through to Latin America, a shift in the type of financial institution, the Inter-American Development Bank. Would love to get some insights into where the IDB is at in this space. You were there a second ago. No, there you are. No, not there you are. That's Cherry. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Now we can. You want to just turn it up a little bit, Maria?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, pretty much. Keep speaking loudly.
Okay. Okay. So as an opportunity also for the region in the recovery phase. A lot of the countries in our region have a huge potential with this. We see more than 40% of global biodiversity being in the region, and hence for IDB and I think for the financial systems in our region, it is key to see ways to promote businesses that can have the aggregated value of natural-based solutions in the value chains. How are we doing that and how we are looking at it? There are different ways to look at that. One is that we need to consider that the different businesses are at different levels of opportunities. There is need of a lot of resources for the very early business stage where we need to do a lot of incubation of business models so that we can demonstrate that these investments can come to fruition. We do believe that there are already today a lot of value chains that, however, can be at the commercial level if we provide solutions of financing of long-term, basically, that can reduce also the perception of risk, and hence also work with more traditional financing guarantees and long-term finance. And for doing that, what we have been doing is combining, let's say, the work IDB does with local DFIs. We work a lot with the national development banks in our region. And also, we have been working with governments, I'm happy to talk about that further, on how to consider developing even the capital market, meaning the green and sustainable bond market, to find ways to value again those kind of investments and promote investors to participate in this kind of activities.
Fantastic, Maria, thank you. And just, it's probably completely obvious to everybody, the meeting hosted by President Macron last year of 450 public development banks pointed to a combined balance sheet of 11.2 trillion US dollars. Yeah, a lot of which is flowing into nature sensitive area because of the focus of many DFIs on agriculture and land use. And so the leadership of the DFI community, as well as the sort of front end risk that you have, means almost certainly that the DFIs will be an important source of learning for the TNFD and also many others going forward. So thank you for that. Sherry, last but not least, inevitably, if there's one thing I know from the work on TNFD so far, is that everybody started by talking about metrics and ended by talking about data. And so it's really great that you're kind of completing the story on the panel in really kind of helping us understand the data piece of this story.
Thank you, Simon. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Always good to check before you plow on. Great. Thank you very much for having me. And you're absolutely right. I think that we would be missing a trick if we didn't really call out the need for data to play a key role in the success of channeling finance into biodiversity and nature positive topics. And I think that, one of the things we do need to call out here is that, the data isn't all there. As being part of the Future of Sustainable Data Alliance, which I'm really honored and proud to chair, actually the disclosure data is only one element of data. And even that, when you think about the number of issuers that are out there in the capital markets and even some of the private investors, the amount of disclosure that's going on out there for things that are already historical, things that are in the ESG bucket, things about emissions, even that is not complete. And our data suggests that actually of that universe of issuers, only 20% of them disclose anything that could be used to account for biodiversity impact or nature-based impacts. And then we look at the data even further and think about, well, what it is that we do have some data on from perhaps the issuer perspective, the perspective of the companies that are out there. Even that can be quite granular and not really help us understand, what good looks like. And what I mean by that is perhaps a data point that we use and most of the data providers out there use would say, do you have a policy on water management? And the data point says yes or no. So again, it gives you an example of where we really need to improve, because where data becomes important in this argument is when it can really adhere to the 3 C's, making sure that the data is coherent, that is comprehensive, and that is comparable. I think all of us on the panel agree that actually this isn't even just at a local level or a comparison across industries level. It is at a truly global level where nature doesn't respect the boundaries of country sovereignty or indeed multinational footprints. And so, there is work to do here. However, I want to make sure that we're not all sort of, come off the end of this thinking with our heads in our hands, we're not there yet, what can we do? We actually do need to move forward and make sure that the perfect is not the enemy of the good. And that actually we rely on understanding what is available so that we can help both regulators as well as investors be able to use what we've got and call out what is really needed, so that this data gap situation that's going on with biodiversity doesn't continue to be what I'd like to call a data hole. And actually that hole is being filled, but incredibly efficiently and effectively, and not only from issuers, but also from governments and from those that are participating in the industry.
Sherry, thank you very much indeed. I guess I would just sort of, I don't know whether it's right to offer, our apologies for stealing part of the CEO of Refinitiv, David Craig, to become the co-chair alongside Elizabeth Marema of the TNFD. But without doubt, apart from the obvious qualities of David, it's a signal of how important the whole place of data will be in the development of this space. So thanks very much indeed for that. We're going to do one more round, and we inevitably have a scarcity of time more than anything else. This is a call for speed, but not a call for haste. Yeah, and I'm going to go through the same group of people, more or less in the same order. So starting with you, Peter, perhaps asking for sort of 60, 90 seconds if you can contain it to that. if we want to amplify and accelerate this work, building on the experience of climate, recognizing the importance of this, thinking about what we really need from CBD, kind of what would be your sort of one pitch, knowing that there is no silver bullet? What's the one thing that each of you would highlight where we really need to lean in and put a lot of additional effort? And Peter, I'm going to start with you if I may.
Thank you, Simon. From our perspective, what we would need from CBD is really a clarity of expectations that we as investors can put forward to corporates ultimately in terms of translating what the CBD Global Biodiversity Framework means in terms of how they change their corporate conduct. And that is where also sort of our plans for a Nature Action 100 would then align with picking up those clear asks, translating that into what a corporate would need to do, and bring the global institutional investor community around those asks, and then seek how to accelerate the work that corporations are doing. And I think that really builds on what Sherry also mentioned, that we are currently not having the data, and we have TNFD that has just been launched but needs to be ultimately developed over the coming 2 years, and we don't have the luxury of waiting for all of these things to fall in place before we get into action. So that is where I think our call to action for investors is really to look out for further announcements into how this will shape up and how they can get involved. And at the same time for the CBD in terms of negotiations to come with a very clear framework that enables investors to get into these conversations with the corporations we invest in.
I am taking notes, thank you. Remember that framework and we'll come back to it. Madeline, what is your one gift wish list for Christmas in this place?
Well, if I look at previous failures of us to reach the goals that were set to be met by 2020, I think what was lacking was, and what we would want now, is clarity. So I agree with Peter, consistency. And then something that gave me a lot of joy was the discussions that happened at the G7 summit recently, that it was integrated climate change with biodiversity, and it was brought to the attention of global leaders. So the last would be worldwide collaboration of governments coming together, really taking this seriously.
Fantastic. And just, I'm going to push you one piece more. What would seriously mean? Get one level more granulated.
So actually taking the targets on board and having the intention of achieving them. I don't think that the scope of the previous targets were maybe wide enough or implicit enough. And maybe this time around we will get the targets that we require. And I'm happy to see that South African government is participating. So.
Fantastic, Madeline. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to keep going through the wish list. Sylvain, you're up. Kind of the one piece that you think can really accelerate this area rapidly.
So you can hear me?
Yes.
Well, clearly, what's my dream coming agreement? It needs a lot of clarity, because general aspirations will not help. We need a framework with a clear roadmap, with targets that are ideally science-based, that steer investor action towards a clear goal. We need a long-term goal, but also hopefully intermediate targets. We need maybe hints about what the right metrics could be. Metrics and data are key, you mentioned this. We also need to make sure that the framework, the agreement, expresses the need for investor portfolio alignment around these objectives. This is what we had in Article 2C of the Paris Agreement. It was hugely helpful. It generated a lot of activity after that. It is a huge justification for action going forward. So clarity, explicit commitments, explicit expectations from private investors, not just public money.
Thank you very much, Sylvain. That's absolutely fantastic. Maria, you're sitting at the nexus of finance, development, and the broader environmental agenda. Kind of what would you see being a kind of major play that could help to move this agenda forward quickly? Maria.
Unmute.
Okay, there we go.
Can you hear me now?
We can.
Okay. Okay. Well, first, I agree with the previous speakers. I think the key here is to be able to leverage and mobilize investments. We need to have a possibility to clearly give what we call, on financial terms, the materiality of the non-financial actually impact. So the materiality of what it is biodiversity, so that investors can start understanding and giving some kind of value to that. And that's, I would say, the most important kind of messaging you need to give to the markets. But if I may add, I think there is need also for an enabling environment for this to happen. So it's important, a framework, it's important to have clarity on what we understand by the materiality of this value that we are giving to biodiversity, but we also need to give a strong push for enabling environments. And you were talking, Simon, about, for example, the use of DFIs or the use of mechanisms that could de-risk, that could incentivize and pilot this kind of investment. So like climate finance is not a lot of money, but it still had a huge role to play in leveraging, along with MDBs, DFIs, governments, private investments. I think it is key here to see how can we develop an enabling environment, let's say, structure that allows us to pilot actually projects that demonstrate this monetary value of biodiversity, and that can help us to pilot, let's say, develop further financial mechanisms like use of green bonds, like financial programs that are directed to that, like programs where investors or funds can demonstrate their impacts. I think it is extremely important also to accompany the framework with some kind of enabling environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. And I would say, again, perhaps obvious to some, but not all of the participants on the call, that, Marjun gave us a lens onto the financial regulatory space. Clearly, we're focused a lot on the market, but actually many, many DFIs around the world, including the IIDB, plays a critical role in helping to create these sorts of policy and institutional enabling environments. So I think absolutely appropriate, Maria, that you're highlighting that. Sherry, last in the line, over to you.
Great. I agree with all of the panelists so far, and just add sort of a bit of a point on regulatory cooperation. I do think that inevitably the regulators will start getting involved. It's one way of pushing the market, but my call is for regulatory cooperation across borders, as well as with the financial institutions and the financial markets, in order to get really clear data needs. So we know that those building blocks of regulation are available and they're the most useful for the market. And if the word regulation leaves some of the audience sort of bored or feeling like that's the dull part of the scope, I'd also like to sort of call for embracing technology, because actually remote sensors, satellite imagery, analytical approaches to geospatial data, using data in different ways. I mean, this is available to us now, and being able to put some effort towards that in the context of building back better, in the context of a post-COVID environment, I think all of that can actually be supported from a governmental level, from a financial level, but also really to be inspired as to how it is we're going to get this data as quickly as possible. That could be a slightly sexier end to this panel.
And Sherry, absolutely brilliant and totally to be emphasized. We've reflected a number of times in TNFD how even in the short period between the beginning of TCFD and TNFD, so 5-6 years, the technology aspects of data have changed dramatically. And the range of sources from which the financial community and the corporate community will source data has changed exponentially. So even though the TNFD is called ... financial disclosure, I think there is a recognition that there's a sort of technology-based shift in the way in which much of the data may be generated, analyzed, and distributed for use. So very, very helpful to emphasize. So I'm going to take a chair's privilege of 30 seconds just to give my version of my Christmas wish list. I think it more or less reaffirms many of the points that the panel has already made extremely well. We learned in some funny ways after Paris how important the 1.5 degree frame was for a credible way in which to build transition risk strategies that could be adopted and built around the financial community. We don't need to be surprised again. CBD can play a powerful role in helping to establish the same framework that we can apply with a nature and a nature climate connected focus going forward beyond Kunming. And then finally, and it really came through in the co-chair's presentation right at the beginning, the mindset, understandably, in intergovernmental negotiations have an awful lot to do with the mobilization of finance. And somebody gives a number and goes, this is how much money we need to invest in nature. But the point that all of you have been making on the panel is that in addition or as well as mobilization, we really need to focus much more on alignment. The alignment of global finance with nature positive outcomes, both on the risk side and also on the opportunity side. And the more that CBD can do to get its head around the power and potential of that alignment agenda, I think the better off we're all going to be. Now, the bad news, ladies and gentlemen, is I'm being told by my minders that we've timed out, even although we moved through the panel discussion really very quickly. So I am of the view, Odile, I think that's right, that we're not going to be able to take Q&A on this, although I'm sure in other ways and forms over the coming 2 days, all of your questions will be asked and also answered. So firstly, let me thank the panel extraordinarily. You've really compressed huge knowledge and experience into a very small number of sound bites, but very clear and helpful sound bites. And once again, thanks CBD and Odile in particular for pulling this meeting together. And with that, Odile, I'll pass back to you.
Thanks a lot, Simon, for your excellent chairmanship. And thank you to all the panelists for sharing your experiences, which illustrate your commitment to biodiversity, but also the challenges you are facing. And I've heard some words, which I don't know if it's a summarized, but the ask for clarity, consistencies, and collaboration with other actors, the need of data, and the urgency also to align financial flows with biodiversity issues. I think there are some words, and I have no doubt that the next panel will provide some answers to your expectations. I have to apologize for the Q&A session, but we are a bit late, and as Simon said, we'll have time to speak either after this panel coming and above all tomorrow morning with all the sessions. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Mr. Gilles Klets, the chair of the second panel on the role of governments and regulators in enabling financial institutions and investors to align financial flows with biodiversity. Gilles Klets is Director of Natural Resources, Agriculture, Water, Forests and Ocean Department at the French Development Agency, AFD. He has been working for 30 years on the links between biodiversity conservation and sustainable development. He has conducted policies and projects for the public service, research institutions, non-governmental organizations, and at IFD. He has also been advisor to several ministers in the field of environment as well as overseas development aid. Gilles, you have the floor until almost four in France, 5 minutes before the end. And if you have time in your panel, it would be very great to have a Q&A session because I see several hands raised. So Gilles, you have the floor. Can you raise your hand and introduce your panel? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Odile. I hope everybody can hear me yes. Clearly. Mm-hmm. So I will be facilitating this second panel, which is a bit like an answer to the first panel, and it is on the role of governments and regulators in enabling financial institutions and investors to align their financial flows to biodiversity positive economy. So it's about rules, regulation, laws, frameworks, including obviously the global biodiversity framework that we are negotiating. Rules and regulation at national and international levels that are conducive, as you understood, to raise more resources, but more profoundly, to effectively green the economy and to steer humanity, not less than that, towards a nature positive footprint. And we all know this is really a complex task made of many different conditions. It's both about financial regulations as well as environmental regulation. It's as well about making sure that we leave no one on the side of the road. So it's as well about social sensibility. And we need to bring all this together. So it's a complex and difficult task in terms of policy, in terms of government and regulator decision. And we have to do that in a very short decade, because we know, and science tells us this, that really we have very little time to reverse the dangerous decline of the living fabric of our planet. So we've heard from panel one, request for clarity, request for availability of data, request for enabling conditions conducive to investing in nature positive activity for investment funds. And we've heard that we need to make sure that the global biodiversity framework really facilitates this enabling condition, so that it's not so much about more public money for biodiversity conservation, but it's more about aligning global financial fluxes towards a nature positive humanity or nature positive economy. So it's really about alignment. So today we have really eminent representatives from the public sectors to tell us a bit in the same manner as in panel one, what the situation is, what is emerging as new enabling conditions, new enabling frameworks, rules and activities that are taking place in central banks, in ministries of finance, but as well in the sector of development finance, NDBs and PDBs, to inspire us a bit in finding the answers that were raised by panel one, and guide us towards providing practical advice to the CBD negotiators and to Basil and Francis in the writing of the Global Biodiversity Framework document. Let me please introduce our panelists now that are from all over the planet. So we have a great diversity. So I will ask the panelists to please raise their hands and come to the floor so that everyone can see them. It will be more lively in this manner. So let me first introduce Mr. Jose Antonio Quesada, who is the Vice President of the Regulatory Policy of the National Banking and Securities Commission from Mexico. I will introduce as well William Lockhart, who's the Head of International Environment Negotiations at DEFRA in the UK, in the United Kingdom. I'll introduce as well Hélène Perrier. She is the lead negotiator on resource mobilization for biodiversity and in the run-up to COP15 at the Environment Directorate General for Environment at the European Commission. We have as well with us Ronald Kagwa, Head of Production, Trade and Tourism Planning at the National Environmental Management Authority in Uganda, so somebody more from the environmental regulation side. And we have, finally, Mrs. Dilruk Shini, who is the Director of Macroprudential Surveillance Department at the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. So please, panelists, come to the floor. There you go. And in the meantime, just a few words to start the discussion. We know that for biodiversity, financing green and greening finance is essentially about three things: disinvesting in biodiversity destructive activities, and we've had very clear introductions on these points. It's as well, second point, about improving risk and impact management to reduce the activity, the impact that we of activities that we invest in. And it's about identifying and securing nature positive investments. And altogether, a common factor in all this, obviously, is improving finance and impact efficiency. So how does these three goals translate for regulators? We have heard already this morning that a lot of regulators are already embarking in some very very promising initiatives, such as central banks, and we've heard about what NGFS is doing. We've heard as well about the role of DFIs, and certainly the 450 public development banks, multilateral, bilateral, that came together last November and actually had a biodiversity statement on their commitment to finance biodiversity positive activities and neutralize anything that would be negative for nature, was a very strong moment. So we are going to hear from our panelists some of the situation and activities at the moment that is taking place in the public sector, in the regulation sector, and that could inspire and shed light on the best ways to answer the needs and expectations that were expressed in panel one. So let me now turn to you, Jose Antonio, and ask you about the activities that are taking place at the National Banking and Securities Commissions in Mexico with regards to looking at biodiversity risks and better integrating them to ensure more economic financial resilience. We've heard some think tanks talk about biodiversity stress tests. We've heard about the World Economic Forum asking for a stronger attention to biodiversity-related risk, whether they're material, systemic, transitional. So can you tell us a bit what is taking place at the moment in Mexico with regards to the activities of the National Banking and Securities Commission on this issue? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gilles. It is a great pleasure for me to participate this morning with you. And I send regards to my fellow panelists as well. And yes, I will make a refresh or an update of the activities that the Banking Commission is doing in Mexico lately. The National Banking and Securities Commission acknowledges the relevance of internalizing risks and opportunities related to biodiversity loss, land degradation, water scarcity, and climate change, since they gravely affect the financial system. Aware of the importance of sustainability, CNBV is part of the Network for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS, the United Nations Global Compact, and has participated in the informal working group of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the TNFD. More recently, the Commission has become supporter of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, and is a member of the Basel Committee's Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Risks, the TFCR. Through its informal working group, we have been working closely in the development of the TNFD, since we have identified an urgent need to understand, study, and use the environmental data beyond carbon. Climate change is just one pillar of environmental market failure. The world's natural capital is also in sharp decline, and without rapid and systemic change, biodiversity loss and landscape degradation will severely disrupt the world economy. Therefore, a much broader scope is needed to address paramount issues that are not included in current global efforts and initiatives. We consider that environmental, social, and governance, the ESGs, financial and non-financial disclosures are of the utmost relevance, and therefore the CNBV in this context is part of the Council of Stability of the Financial System in Mexico, which decided to create the Committee of Sustainability Finance, founded in November 2020, which is leading and coordinating the task force working group for information disclosure and adoption of ESG standards, which is comprised of the authorities of the Mexican financial system and is working towards achieving the following objectives. First of all, analyzing the state of the art of the different disclosure frameworks and standards in terms of ESG indicators to better comprehend their similarities and differences. Second, capacity building for key stakeholders of the financial system in terms of ESG comprehension. Third, understanding the regulatory efforts that are being developed in other jurisdictions. And fourth, identifying best practices of ESG information disclosure that could be adopted and adapted to the Mexican context. So in a nutshell is what I can share with you about the status that we have currently in Mexico, Gilles. I think it's muted. You are muted.
Yeah, there you go. Sorry. Thank you very much, Jose Antonio. I think this is very impressive. And I think for a lot of regulators, very dynamic countries like Mexico are inspiring in the evolution of this regulatory framework. And what might be interesting in the perspective of the CBD negotiations is really to understand how regulators and the finance sector actors dialogue to together push the regulatory framework and the enabling environment in the right direction, because this dialogue is crucial. And sometimes in negotiation, we have situation where the public sector feels, in a way, especially ministries of finance, shy to disrupt financial activities, and a good dialogue on actual positive avenues and positive pushes basically is key and will be key, I think, in the coming years. Let me now turn talking about ministries of finance to William Lockhart from the UK. You are now at DEFRA, but I know you were working, I've read you were working before in the Ministry of Finance. And I would like to ask you, what role should ministries of finance play to improve the environmental performance and especially the biodiversity performance of the financial sector? As you know, for the Paris Agreement on climate, ministries of finance were very active. In the preparation and run-up to COP15, my observation is that ministries of finance are not altogether involved. I mean, this is not the case for UK, because we've had the Dasgupta report and some strong involvement from Treasury on your side. But can you tell us a bit what you feel about the involvement of ministries of finance in the run-up to COP15 and how they could play a role in improving an enabling environment for biodiversity?
Of course. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. Good. I'm very relieved. Wonderful. Thank you, Gilles, and to all the other speakers today. It's been an absolutely fascinating afternoon here in London so far. So I'm delighted to say that the UK government is pursuing a hugely ambitious approach to the CBD negotiations, including on the question of resource mobilisation. And on this, as you say, actually our finance ministry in particular, Her Majesty's Treasury, has taken a really leading role. I think it's driven in part by, as you mentioned, our presidency of the UNFCCC COP26 conference in Glasgow this year, as well as the meetings of the G7 that we hosted over the past few weeks and that were mentioned earlier in the afternoon as well. This week alone, in fact, the government published our response to Professor Dasgupta's review into the economics of biodiversity, which lays out a number of steps that finance ministries in particular can take to mainstream biodiversity into their financial decisions. I think we've talked a lot today about how it's that mainstreaming opportunity that really is the sort of systemic level of change that we need to see governments commit to in order to be able to drive the outcomes that we want to see in the convention. The response to the Dasgupta review, the response that we published this week, really critically commits the UK government to a future that we will call nature positive, and ensuring that nature positive decisions underline everything that we do. What does that mean in practice? What it means in practice, I'm so sorry, my cat has joined us. I didn't know he was in the room. Can you give me 2 seconds and I'll come back to you?
Sure.
I'll pick up my list. I'm very embarrassed. Wait there.
Sure. So while the cat is gently being removed from the screen, I think what is really interesting in the moves with the Dasgupta report is indeed the practical advice that was given to ministries of finance, and the overall simple idea is climate and biodiversity evaluation of national budgets, for example. It's absolutely key, and it's still a very rare practice to have a thorough evaluation. So maybe William, you can tell us a bit more if we are up to speed for such a practice in the UK. We're clearly not in France, but we are trying to push the government to do that. But I do think it would be indeed, a clear, fundamental, positive sign in terms of enabling environment for the private sector and for the finance actors. What do you feel about that?
Oh, we completely agree. Absolutely. So one of the commitments that we have made in the response to the Dasgupta review relates to national natural capital accounting. So the UK has this week formally recognized that there are limitations to GDP. Last year, we became one of the first countries to publish natural capital accounts as part of our national accounts. And what we've committed to now is that was a pilot, if you like. And so what we've committed to now is increased funding to improve these accounts and to make sure that government decision makers, around all the different departments in government are factoring those national natural capital accounts into their decisions, the impact on the national natural capital stock, if you like, when they make their decisions. The second thing that the finance ministry in the UK is doing is really ensuring that biodiversity values are driven deep into policy making processes. So some of you will be familiar with our book, which is an instruction book, if you like, on how to appraise policies, programs, and projects used and adopted around the world. I'm very proud to say, and following quite a lengthy process of working with experts on natural capital and biodiversity science from around the world, the Green Book now contains really extensive guidance on how to value natural capital, how to value biodiversity, and how to factor that in really, on the desk of the individual policymaker to make sure that those things are being considered in all of the policies, that governments take forward. Some of the other things that we'll be doing, that we've committed to are, of course, slightly more, maybe more immediately obvious to colleagues on this conference. So last year we announced that we'll issue our first sovereign green bond in 2021. This is an area, of course, where a number of other countries have also taken similar steps. But what we also announced this week is that under that green bond, we will include expenditures which are eligible under our own financing framework, but which relate to the net zero transition. But not only net zero related expenditure, also explicitly biodiversity expenditure will count towards our sovereign green bond. I'll wrap up shortly. That's just 3 examples of what governments can do. Of course, there's plenty more, as we've heard. So on multilateral development banks, for instance, and ahead of COP26, we recognise the critical part that multilateral development banks have to play in the fight against climate change and biodiversity loss. And we are calling on MDBs to agree a joint statement committing them to mainstream nature into their analysis, dialogue, and operations. I hope that is a helpful answer to your question. And thank you all for witnessing the UK government's commitment to biodiversity by having my cat feature in this discussion.
Thank you, William. This is very helpful. So, policy evaluation, the mobilization of natural capital practice in that effort, and really valuing natural capital and looking at the sort of net impact of policies on natural capital. This is absolutely key. Sovereign green bonds, clear market signal, indeed, a very important point. And the use of public finance institutions like MDBs or PDBs. Indeed, they are under the same authority with the state being their main or only shareholder. They can really implement a stronger biodiversity positive policies. We're going to travel to Sri Lanka, and I'm going to turn to Mrs. Dirukshini. You play a key role for Sri Lanka Central Bank, who is very active in sustainable finance and green finance. We know that you have been quite active in taking into account, the climate impact and sometimes climate disasters on the financial system. Do you think taking into account as well biodiversity-related risks can be addressed in the same way and incorporated in your sort of prudential policies in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, if I start with the central bank, how it views climate change through its relevance for achieving the mandated objectives of price stability and financial system stability. The Central Bank of Sri Lanka have 2 main objectives, mandatory objectives, which is price stability and financial system stability. And we all know that global warming is one of the many reasons affecting the price stability and financial system stability, basically climate risk. Sri Lanka is also very much vulnerable to these climate-related disasters at present. And system stability and price stability objectives are threatened by climate-related disasters. Especially in the context of Sri Lanka, these climate-related disasters have become an annual occurrence. So in this background, the central bank had a concern, like many other central banks around the globe, they have on managing this climate risk. So with the, if I say the initiative has basically come from the government with the implementation of the Sustainable Development Agenda. Sri Lankan government also has identified several development priorities, including environmental sustainability and promoting green businesses. So in line with this government Sustainable Development Agenda, Central Bank of Sri Lanka developed a roadmap for sustainable finance. I must acknowledge that the financial support we received from UNDP Biofin for developing the sustainable finance taxonomy and sustainable finance roadmap. And at the moment, we are in the process of developing a sustainable finance taxonomy
with a more focus on green finance aspects. And for this roadmap development and the sustainable finance taxonomy development, in Sri Lanka, we have established basically two steering committees. Steering committee at the central bank, which is the working committee basically, and a steering committee consists of other stakeholders. I mean the Bankers Association, Colombo Stock Exchange, and with those regulators. So we bring them into a one platform in discussing this, and UNDP also will be a partner there in discussing and finalizing the taxonomy. So we expect the taxonomy I'm sure that the biodiversity concerns will be addressed through green financing mechanism, as explained by Dr. Majun in his keynote address. The mechanism will be established, this mechanism to be established in a more coherent manner with this upcoming taxonomy. And the taxonomy is expected to set standards for the financial sector to effectively manage environmental and social risk. And I would like to mention that taxonomy development will be a coordinated effort where stakeholders' consultation will be crucial in developing a taxonomy which should be acceptable at the international level and which need to be developed taking into account the Sri Lankan context. So I'm sure that in developing the taxonomy, we will be looking at the biodiversity aspects as well.
Thank you very much for this. I mean, this is I take two very crucial points in your precious comments. One is the need to establish platforms for dialogue in this time of change, in this time of really creating something rather new in terms of enabling conditions for taking into account climate and biodiversity risks in our financial regulatory environments. Dialogue is key, and multi-stakeholders dialogue at national level especially, but consistent with international rules as well, as you said. I think this is one key point. A second point is taxonomy and developing a precise, clear, operational list of activities that are negative or positive for the environment is absolutely a key element of an enabling environment that is really awaited for by lots of the a lot of the finance community. So thank you again. And talking of taxonomy, I would like to turn now to Hélène Perrier from the European Commission and ask you, Hélène, how do you see the usefulness of the taxonomy that is being developed at EU level for biodiversity? Is there specific elements for biodiversity that can be useful to the finance community in there? What sort of practical benefits can we expect for biodiversity in the very broad and ambitious EU taxonomy that is being developed? Thanks.
Thank you, Gilles, and good time of the day to all of you. I mean, indeed, I think what we heard earlier today is that if we wish to unlock the investments that we need for nature, and at the same time, if we want to stop the rest harming biodiversity, I think what we've heard is that governments must provide long-term certainty for investors and help embed sustainability in the financial system. And for us in the EU, this sustainable finance taxonomy is an essential instrument. I mean, of course, there is a lot in it for biodiversity and ecosystems. As you may know, we've been busy with developing this taxonomy regulations in the EU for quite some time now. An important step for us was last April, where we adopted our first taxonomy regulation that focused on climate mitigation and adaptation. And now, as you may know, for us, the next step is to look at the 4 remaining environmental areas. And here, biodiversity and ecosystems are a big part of that. And the ambition for us is to adopt a taxonomy, including for biodiversity and ecosystems in 2022. So as you've just said, Gilles, the idea is really to define a common classification of economic activities that can substantially contribute to protecting and restoring biodiversity and ecosystems. So now we're working hard on making that become a reality, looking at criteria, types of activities. I think here you're asking about what benefits are we expecting from this taxonomy. I mean, obviously, the idea is really to help guide investments towards a nature positive economy and a green recovery. I mean, that's the overall ambition, as you can imagine. The idea is that tools like that can really significantly increase the potential that green financing offers to support the transition, in particular for nature negative sectors where we all know there is an urgent need for change. So I think that's the overall ambition. Now, I mean, of course, as I've said, one of the ideas is really to identify those activities that are green and that can contribute to biodiversity in a positive way. But for us, one of the key concepts behind the EU taxonomy is that it's also supposed to help transitioning from brown activities to a greener economy. And that's very much linked to the do no harm principle that is enshrined in the European Green Deal. And we are working hard to operationalize that in the EU budget, public money. But for the taxonomy, it's really a core element. How can we make sure that investments do no harm to the environment in general, including to biodiversity and ecosystems? And maybe a final element related to the benefits that we were expecting from the taxonomy is to improve transparency. I mean, that's really one of the key objectives. I think for us, what we're expecting is increased transparency based on the use of the taxonomy in the future to try and also significantly lower the costs of identifying and selecting sustainable economic investments and to, stop greenwashing at the end of the day. I think that's really one of the issues we are facing now. And that's one of the objectives of the EU taxonomy, to really significantly improve transparency. So, I mean, that's one of the maybe main takeaway messages I would have, even though as part of the EU policy on sustainable finance, we actually do much more than the taxonomy. We have a sustainable finance strategy. We're working hard on having a new EU corporate sustainability reporting directive and many other things. So I'll stop there at this stage.
Thank you, Hélène. This is very precious. So EU taxonomy sending clear signs to the market about positive green investment areas as a means as well to transit from brown to green. Transparency as a key element, and the do no harm principle, which is more and more enshrined in many regulatory environments around the world, and which is one of the clear signs that the market and the financiers and the corporate sector can build upon. We're now going to turn rapidly to our last speaker, Ronald.
Can I interrupt you? We are at the end of the meeting, but the technical team tells me that if you want, if possible for everyone, we can have 10 more minutes. So feel free to have these 10 more minutes if you can. Thanks.
Thank you. Sorry for this time. The discussion has been rich. So Ronald Kagwa, you work at the National Authority on Environmental the Environmental Authority of Uganda, NEMA, and we have been.
Can you please give the floor to Gilles Kletz?
Hello?
Yes, Mr. Kagwa. I don't know why Mr. Gilles Kletz is out. So perhaps you can have the floor and he will come back. Thank you. Please, Mr. Kagwa, it's to you.
Thank you very much, Gilles. Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, Gilles was giving an introduction about me. I work in the National Planning Authority of Uganda as manager production, trade, and tourism planning. Now, the question that I want to give myself to in the absence of Gilles is to understand the role of natural capital in the financing of biodiversity, but also understand the role of natural capital accounting to the financial institutions. How do we align the objectives of natural capital accounting to the financing, flows, biodiversity financing flows? What I want to mention that natural capital accounting gives us a better understanding of the importance of biodiversity to the economy and livelihoods. And the government of Uganda has taken natural capital accounting as a tool of natural resource management, as a tool of biodiversity management in the country. Natural capital accounting helps us as regulators to understand the linkage between the economy and biodiversity. Biodiversity supports the economy. Uganda's economy is dependent on natural resources. Tourism is the leading foreign exchange earner, which is the biodiversity, based sector. Agriculture, all these forestry, fisheries are key biodiversity rich sectors which support the economy. So natural capital accounting helps us to understand that very critical linkage between the economy and development. It's also important to understand the cost of natural capital degradation on the economy and livelihoods of our people. Natural capital accounting, again, has been used in Uganda to appreciate the cost of degradation of these natural assets, the implications to economic growth, the implications to employment, the implications to national development objectives, including macroeconomic stability. So that understanding is very, very critical, and natural capital accounting is a key tool for enabling us to understand that. It's also important to mention here that Uganda has taken natural capital accounting as a critical tool which enables us to better understand our GDP and what it constitutes. It enables us to go beyond GDP as a tool of natural resource, of national income, measurement. It points out the gaps in the GDP. So Uganda has adopted, like the UK, natural capital accounting as a critical tool for, measurement, better understanding of our economy, better understanding of wealth that has been created in the country. Wealth creation is a key aspect of our development policy, and want to see that our wealth is growing year by year. And the measurement of wealth has been limited to man-made wealth, physical wealth, natural capital, and a very important component of wealth has not been, taken into account. So as regulators, we have brought this in the National Development Dialogue, the National Development Table, and it is being taken on by our institutions, including commercial banks, the central bank. The central bank is part of the national, national economic measurement process. It also participates in GDP, calculations. So we have integrated natural capital accounting in the national development system and measurement of our GDP. I think I want to stop there on that question. I thank you.
I thank you a lot, Mr. Ogwal. I'm really, really, really sorry. I don't know what is happening, but Gilles Klets is disconnected and apparently has problem to reconnect. So I will conclude this panel on his behalf. I'm sorry for that. And thank all the panelists, and thank Gilles also for his chairmanship, and thanks all the panelists of your really interesting and enlightening description of what you are still doing in terms of biodiversity, sure, but in terms of relation and actions with the financial sector. I heard several interesting things as a need of policy evaluation, mobilization of natural capital practices, the need of developing tools and new financial mechanism as green bonds, the importance, yes, he's here back. So I was concluding, Gilles. So I let you the floor to conclude this panel. And because you will do that much better than I. So please, Gilles, do that. Oh, he's gone. No, he's gone. So I continue. The need of new financial mechanism as green bonds, the important role of MDBs and PDBs, the Public Development Bank, helping the private sector and helping also governments to develop policies such as UNDP Biofin, also helping development and regulators. So that's and we saw the examples in Sri Lanka, in Mexico. That's really important. The need of dialogue with platform, of multi-stakeholder approach, and it make an echo with what was said before with the private financial and public also financial actors in the previous panel. The need of tools as taxonomy, of transparency, of natural capital accounting, as you were saying. So a lot of things have been said today, and I really once again thank you all for this really rich and well documented seminars that we had today. There is a lot of material, I think, for our co-chairs first, for the Global Biodiversity Framework, and also for the workshop of tomorrow, because we continue tomorrow. As you know, we have another session tomorrow morning from 8 to 11 Montreal time. We will begin directly in breakout group discussions. All registered participants have been grouped into stakeholder groups to define and simplify the position of each stakeholder group and not to debate among ourselves. Contradictory positions, if any, will be explained during the closing panel. We have 3 groups composed mainly of representatives of private financial institutions and businesses, 1 group of public financial institutions, 3 groups of representatives of governments and regulators, and 1 group of civil society. You should log into your breakout group according to the link that was provided to you by email on Tuesday. You will remain in that group for the 2 sessions that will take place tomorrow from 8 to 9 and then 9 to 10 Montreal time. Each breakout group will be facilitated by a chair with the help of a note taker, and we will discuss 2 issues: proposal for key actions to align financial flows with biodiversity policies, and the way of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework could support and promote these actions. You have received a preparatory documentation for the first session. That's a list of key actions. It's also published on the CBD website, and the link is mentioned in the mail you received Tuesday, but we will surely resend it this afternoon. The last part of tomorrow's session will be in plenary. You will therefore need to log out during the breakout at 10, and to log in, you using the same link you are using today. Sorry for all these manipulations that you have to do. And during the closing panel, some of the chairs will report on the main concluding points of their breakout groups, and a synthesis will be made. Then Mr. Basil Van Havre and Francis Ogwal, followed by the heads of UNEPFI and UNPRI, will react to these points before the conclusion made by Elisabeth Bremer. So once again, I thank you all for your participation today. I wish you a good afternoon or evening or night, depending where you are, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thank you and see you tomorrow.